I'm Christian, and for 11 years, I thought I had a good life. My wife Zara and I had a marriage that wasn't perfect but worked, or so I believed. We built a life together with our 8-year-old daughter, Mona, a sweet, sensitive little girl who had Zara's quiet charm and my stubborn streak. If I'm honest, I wasn't around as much as I should have been. My job, which I didn't love but paid well, kept me tied up late most nights. Zara always said she understood, that we were making sacrifices for the future. That night started like so many others. I was coming home late, tired and distracted, replaying the endless monotony of meetings and spreadsheets in my head. All I wanted was to collapse on the couch and maybe get a quiet hug from Mona before bed. As I pulled into the driveway, the house was darker than usual, except for the faint glow from the upstairs windows. Inside, it was unusually quiet. Mona wasn't on the couch watching her cartoons, and the soft hum of the nursery workers' TV wasn't there either. I immediately felt uneasy. I called out for Mona and Zara, but the silence that answered only made the pit in my stomach grow. Heading up the stairs, I froze halfway up. There was noise, faint at first, then clearer as I climbed. It wasn't laughter or music but voices, muffled and distorted, followed by creaking sounds. I reached the top of the stairs, my heart pounding, and stopped outside our bedroom door. My phone was already in my hand. I don't know why I thought to record, but I hit the button instinctively. My fingers felt stiff as I pushed the door open. What I saw inside will haunt me forever. Zara was there, not alone, tangled in a moment that was far beyond forgivable. Worse than that, there were 2 men with her, and none of them seemed remotely ashamed or aware of the destruction they just unleashed. They didn't even stop. My breath caught in my chest, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. I didn't confront her. The rage and betrayal coursing through me were drowned out by one overpowering instinct. I needed to get Mona out of this house. I backed away, shutting the door as quietly as possible, and hurried to her room. There she was, sitting with the nursery worker, lost in her own little world of cartoons. My chest tightened as I thought about how close she'd been to all of this, how vulnerable and exposed she was in what should have been her safe haven. I took Mona's hand, grabbing a small overnight bag we kept packed for trips to my mom's. The nursery worker looked surprised but didn't ask questions as I told her she could go. My voice was tight, and my hands were trembling. Mona, sensing my unease, asked me why we were leaving. I struggled for words and finally just said we were going to see Grandma for a while. On the drive to my mom's house, Mona dozed off in the back seat, her head resting against the car seat. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror and felt my chest ache. She didn't deserve this. None of it. My mind was racing, and the betrayal hit me in waves. How long had this been going on? Was it a one-time thing or something deeper? And how could Zara bring this into our home, the place our daughter should feel most secure? When we arrived, my mom took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I didn't have the strength to explain it all yet, so I just told her we needed to stay the night. She tucked Mona into bed while I sat at the kitchen table, replaying the night over and over in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Zara in that room. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the audacity, the cold disregard for our family. For 11 years, I'd trusted her, believed in the life we were building together. Now, it felt like everything I thought I knew was a lie. The morning after we arrived at my mom's, I woke up to the sound of Mona laughing in the kitchen. It was soft, light, just her and Grandma playing some silly game over breakfast. For a split second, it felt like any other day, but then reality hit me like a freight train. My stomach sank as the memories of the night before came flooding back. I stayed in bed a little longer, trying to gather myself. What was I even supposed to do next? My job had always been about solving problems, handling crises, and making decisions, but this wasn't something I was trained for. Divorce, custody, explaining to Mona why her world was about to change forever. Every option felt impossible. By the time I went downstairs, Mona was sitting at the table, happily munching on toast. She turned to me with her big, innocent eyes and asked if Mommy was coming later. My throat tightened, and I forced myself to smile as I told her I wasn't sure yet. My mom, who had been slicing fruit, gave me a look, not judgmental, but concerned. She didn't ask questions, but I could tell she knew it was serious. As soon as Mona was distracted with cartoons, I stepped into the hallway and pulled out my phone. My finger hovered over Zara's name in my contacts. What was I even going to say? I hadn't spoken to her since leaving the house. The thought of hearing her voice made my skin crawl. Still, I needed to start dealing with this mess. With a deep breath, I sent her a text. Mona and I are at Mom's. I'll reach out when I'm ready to talk. Her reply came almost instantly. Christian, please let's talk. I can explain. Explain? I stared at the message, anger bubbling up again. What could she possibly explain that would make any of this okay? Instead of answering, I opened my gallery and looked at the video I had taken the night before. Proof. Cold, undeniable proof of what I'd seen. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart on my screen. But it was mine. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I spent most of it playing with Mona, doing my best to act normal, even though my mind was somewhere else entirely. Mom could tell something was eating me up inside. She didn't push, but she did sit with me on the porch after Mona went down for a nap. You don't have to tell me everything, she said gently, her voice barely above a whisper. But whatever it is, you'll get through it. You've got Mona, and you've got me. Her words should have been comforting, but they only made the weight on my chest heavier. I nodded, staring out at the quiet street, wondering how I'd explain all this to Mona one day. She deserved honesty, but how much could an 8-year-old even understand? When evening rolled around, I started looking up lawyers. I'd never thought I'd need one for something like this, but there I was, reading articles about divorce and custody. Each page made the situation feel more real, more final. I couldn't stay in this marriage, not after what I'd seen. And yet, the idea of unraveling everything Zara and I had built was terrifying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying moments from our life together. Our wedding day, the time we found out Zara was pregnant with Mona, the nights we stayed up late planning our future. How had we gone from that to this? At some point, I gave up on trying to rest and went downstairs. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, so I stepped outside and sat on the porch steps, staring at the stars. For the first time, it hit me that there was no fixing this. Zara wasn't the woman I thought she was, and the life I thought we had was gone. It was like standing in the middle of a burned-down house, surrounded by ashes and smoke, trying to figure out what to salvage. The next morning, I woke up to a string of messages from Zara. They ranged from desperate pleas for us to talk to bold declarations that I was overreacting and we needed to handle this like adults. I couldn't bring myself to reply. What could I even say? I hadn't fully processed what had happened, and Zara seemed more concerned with damage control than the actual damage she'd done. Mona, blissfully unaware, tugged at my sleeve, asking if we could go to the park. I said yes without thinking. I needed to clear my head, and maybe seeing her laugh and run around would help me shake this weight pressing on my chest. My mom, ever the quiet support, packed us some snacks and waved us off with a reassuring smile. At the park, Mona climbed the jungle gym and made up games with other kids while I sat on a bench, phone in hand. Zara's messages were still sitting there, unread. I stared at her name for a long time before finally opening the thread. I forced myself to read through everything, no matter how much it made my stomach churn. She kept saying we needed to talk, that it wasn't what it looked like, and that Mona needed us both. I scoffed under my breath. It wasn't what it looked like? I had it on video. If she wanted to twist this into something innocent, she'd picked the wrong hill to die on. As Mona swung happily nearby, I did the only thing I could think of. I called a divorce lawyer. The woman on the other end of the line had a calm, professional tone as she asked me basic questions about our marriage, our finances, and custody of Mona. Saying the words out loud, divorce, infidelity, custody, made it all feel brutally real. When the lawyer asked if I had evidence of Zara's infidelity, I hesitated for a moment before telling her I had video proof. There was a pause, then she told me to save it and make sure I didn't confront Zara without legal advice. She explained how to begin filing and what steps I'd need to take next. By the time I hung up, I felt like I'd been dragged through a storm, but at least I had a plan, or the start of one. Back at home, my mom asked how the park was, and I told her Mona had fun. I was avoiding eye contact, and she picked up on it immediately. She didn't press me though, just handed me a cup of coffee and told me to take some time for myself while she watched Mona. I took the coffee and sat on the porch, scrolling through pictures of Mona on my phone. Her gap-toothed smile, the silly poses she made when she thought no one was looking, it was all a reminder of why I had to stay strong. That evening, Zara called. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. And again. Finally, I caved and picked up. Her voice was frantic, demanding to know where I was and why I'd taken Mona without saying anything. I stayed calm, but inside, I was barely holding it together. I told her she knew exactly why I left, and that until I figured things out, Mona and I would be staying with my mom. Zara started crying, saying she'd made a mistake, that it had been a moment of weakness, and that she couldn't lose her family over this. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A mistake? That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. Several choices, in fact, that she made willingly, repeatedly, and in our home. I told her I'd spoken to a lawyer. She gasped, and her tone shifted from pleading to defensive. She said it wasn't fair for me to make decisions without talking to her first, that I was blowing everything out of proportion. I calmly told her I wasn't making decisions. I was preparing for the fallout of her decisions. When the call ended, I felt drained, like I'd just run a marathon with no finish line. Mona came over and sat beside me, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. She asked if Mommy would be joining us soon. Her question hit me like a punch to the gut, but I managed to smile and tell her that we were having a little adventure with Grandma for now. That night, as Mona slept soundly in the next room, I stared at the ceiling, wondering how I was supposed to rebuild my life from here. Everything felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter what little I had left. But one thing was clear, I couldn't let Zara back in, not after what she'd done. The days that followed felt like walking through a fog, one step at a time, with no clear destination in sight. I had filed for divorce, and though I hadn't yet told Zara, the paperwork was in motion. I'd sent the video to the lawyer as evidence, just like she'd instructed, but the shame of even having it on my phone made me sick. Every time I scrolled past it, I was reminded of how utterly shattered my marriage was. Zara, of course, didn't give up. She called every day, her tone shifting between desperate apologies, anger, and, somehow, accusations that I was overreacting. Her messages were a mix of pleading for another chance and deflecting blame. She claimed she wasn't herself that night, that it was the first time anything like that had happened, and that I had misunderstood everything. I wanted to believe her. I really did. A part of me thought about Mona and the family we'd built and wondered if maybe, just maybe, I was acting too fast. But then I'd remember what I'd seen, and any thought of reconciliation would vanish. That wasn't something you could misunderstand. That was something you chose to do. One afternoon, Zara sent a long, rambling text. She asked me to meet her at the house to talk things through, claiming it was time to be adults and figure out what to do for Mona's sake. Against my better judgment, I agreed. The thought of going back to that house made my skin crawl, but I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. When I arrived, she was already waiting. The house looked the same, but it felt different. The warmth it once held was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Zara looked like she hadn't slept much. She had that slightly disheveled put-together look she always wore when trying to make an impression, except now, it just felt hollow. She started talking the moment I stepped inside, her words rushing out as if saying them faster would make them more believable. She apologized repeatedly, saying she didn't know what came over her, that she loved me and Mona, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing us. Her voice cracked, and she teared up, but all I could feel was anger simmering beneath the surface. I told her I had filed for divorce. The words seemed to stun her, and for a moment, she was silent. Then, like a switch flipped, she turned defensive, accusing me of being cruel and impulsive. She argued that one mistake shouldn't erase 11 years of marriage, that I was taking this too far. I told her it wasn't just one mistake, it was a deliberate choice, and the fact that it happened under the same roof where our daughter sleeps made it even worse. She tried to argue, claiming she'd been lonely because I was always working, that she'd felt neglected. That one stung, not because it was an excuse, but because part of it was true. I had been consumed by work, but I'd thought we were a team, sacrificing together for a better future. I told her that no amount of loneliness justified what she'd done. She started crying again, begging for another chance, but I didn't waver. I handed her a copy of the divorce papers and told her I'd provide for Mona and keep things as civil as possible, but there was no going back. Before I left, I brought up the video. Her face turned pale, and she stammered, asking if I still had it. I told her I'd given it to my lawyer as evidence, and her expression shifted from fear to anger. She accused me of trying to ruin her life, of using Mona as a pawn. It was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. If anything, I was trying to protect Mona from the fallout of her mother's actions. I walked out without saying another word. As I drove back to my mom's, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my chest felt heavy. The weight of everything was suffocating, but I knew I had made the right decision. Zara's tears, her excuses, her pleas, they were all just noise now. My focus had to be on Mona, on giving her some sense of stability in a world that was rapidly crumbling around her. That night, as I tucked Mona into bed, she asked if I was sad. It was a simple question, but it broke me. I told her I was, but that everything would be okay. She hugged me tightly, her little arms wrapped around my neck, and whispered that she loved me. It was the first time in days I felt a glimmer of hope, even if it was small. Mona was my anchor, my reason to keep moving forward. No matter how shattered I felt, I couldn't let her see me fall apart. The emergency custody hearing was the first time I'd been face to face with Zara since leaving the house. She arrived late, wearing a sleek dress that screamed overconfidence. Her posture was upright, her head held high, and I could see it in her expression. She thought she could charm her way through this. Me? I was running on fumes, a combination of sleepless nights and anxiety, but I held on to the thought of Mona. I had to stay composed, no matter what. Zara's lawyer opened by painting her as the devoted mother I once believed she was. He called her actions a lapse in judgment, a mistake made in a moment of weakness. He argued that I had been rash and unfair by taking Mona and leaving without explanation. Zara even cried on the stand, claiming she felt blindsided and devastated that her family was being torn apart. It was difficult to watch. This wasn't the woman I'd built a life with, this was someone performing, rewriting the story to suit her. I knew the truth, but hearing her twist it made my stomach churn. Every word felt like a slap in the face, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't about proving her wrong, it was about proving what Mona needed. My lawyer took a different approach. She spoke with clarity and purpose, presenting facts that Zara's side couldn't spin. She talked about stability, safety, and what a child needs to thrive. The video came up, and Zara's lawyer immediately objected, calling it an invasion of privacy. For a moment, I thought the judge might agree, but then they ruled it admissible given the circumstances. Watching the footage play out in that courtroom was gut-wrenching. I avoided looking at Zara. I didn't need to see her reaction. When it was my turn to speak, I focused entirely on Mona. I talked about her bedtime routine, the way she gets so excited about drawing, and how I've always done my best to provide for her. My voice cracked a couple of times, but I didn't care. I wasn't there to argue with Zara or prove who was the better parent. I was there to fight for my daughter's well-being. After hours of back and forth, the judge made their ruling. I was granted temporary sole custody while the divorce and custody case played out. Zara was given supervised visitation, something she clearly hadn't expected. Her face turned red, her jaw tight as if she couldn't believe this was happening. As I left the courtroom, I could feel her glare burning into my back. On the drive home, Mona sat in the back seat, humming quietly as she played with a toy. She had no idea what had just happened, how much was at stake, or how close I'd come to breaking under the pressure. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her small, innocent face, and felt a wave of determination wash over me. She was why I was doing this. When we got back to my mom's, Mona immediately ran to the kitchen to show Grandma her latest drawing. I followed slowly, sitting at the table while they laughed over silly faces and bright colors. My mom passed me a cup of tea, her usual silent way of saying, "You did good." Later that night, as I tucked Mona into bed, she handed me her drawing. It was a picture of the three of us, me, her and Zara, all holding hands in front of our house. My heart broke as I stared at it, knowing how much she wanted that picture to be real. I kissed her forehead and told her how much I loved her before heading to my room. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Winning temporary custody was a relief, but I knew this was only the beginning. Zara wasn't going to let this go without a fight. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the day's events, and braced myself for the battles still to come. The temporary custody ruling didn't sit well with Zara. I knew it wouldn't. For the first few days, things were oddly quiet. No angry texts, no late-night calls. I should have known that silence wasn't peace, it was preparation. Zara wasn't the type to let anything go, and when she finally made her next move, it came hard and fast. I got a call from my lawyer early one morning. She sounded calm but serious as she told me that Zara had filed a motion to amend the custody arrangement. Apparently, Zara was claiming I was unfit to parent Mona full-time. The accusations ranged from me being emotionally unavailable to putting work above family. She even dredged up old arguments from years ago, twisting them into some narrative that painted her as the victim. The allegations hurt, even if they were baseless. I had always been the provider, the one holding our little family together, even when work consumed me more than I liked. Hearing her distort that into neglect was like being punched in the gut. My lawyer assured me we had nothing to worry about as long as I stayed focused, but it was hard not to feel rattled. Zara's motion also included a request for increased visitation rights, claiming that limited contact with her was harming Mona emotionally. The irony of her trying to play the concerned parent wasn't lost on me. But it was Mona who weighed on my mind most. She adored her mom and didn't fully understand what was happening. How could I protect her without making her feel like she had to choose sides? The first supervised visitation was scheduled for that weekend. Zara insisted on meeting at a local park, somewhere public. I agreed because it felt safer that way. Mona was excited to see her mom, and I didn't want to dampen that, but my anxiety grew as we approached the park. Zara was already there when we arrived, looking perfectly composed as usual. She greeted Mona with open arms, showering her with affection. For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the woman I fell in love with, the warm, caring Zara who could light up any room. But it didn't last. Her eyes darted toward me, and her expression hardened. While Mona played on the swings, Zara took the opportunity to confront me. She accused me of poisoning Mona against her, of using the legal system to punish her. She called me controlling, said I was acting out of bitterness and pride. I let her rant, keeping my responses short and calm. I knew she was trying to provoke me, and I refused to give her that satisfaction. The visit ended without any major incidents, but Zara's words stuck with me. She made it clear that she wasn't going to stop fighting, and I could see the anger simmering beneath her polished facade. Back at home, Mona was buzzing about seeing her mom. She talked about how Zara had promised to take her to her favorite museum once everything was back to normal. I didn't have the heart to tell her that nothing about this situation was normal, nor would it be any time soon. That night, I found myself going through old photos on my phone. Pictures from family vacations, birthdays, and lazy Sundays in the backyard. There was so much love in those moments, or at least it had felt that way at the time. I couldn't help but wonder when things had started to go wrong. Was it gradual, slipping through the cracks while I was busy with work, or had Zara always been this person, hiding behind a mask? Whatever the answer, it didn't change the present. I was in for the fight of my life, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for Mona's future. And if Zara wanted to play dirty, I'd have to be ready. Mona had started asking more questions. One night, as I tucked her into bed, she looked up at me and asked when Mommy would be coming back home. Her voice was soft, but her words carried the kind of weight no child should have to bear. I sat down beside her, taking her hand in mine. I told her that sometimes moms and dads need to figure things out separately, and while it might feel different for a while, it didn't mean we loved her any less. She listened carefully, her eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I could fully give. "But why can't you fix it?" she asked, her innocence cutting straight through me. I told her we had tried but that some things were too hard to fix. I promised her that no matter what, both her mom and I loved her more than anything. She seemed to accept that for now, nodding slowly before hugging me tightly. After she fell asleep, I stayed by her side, wondering how much of the truth she would need to know one day and how I would ever find the words to tell her. The next day, I found myself looking at real estate listings during lunch. Staying at my mom's was a blessing, but it wasn't a long-term solution. Going back to the house I'd shared with Zara wasn't an option either. It didn't feel like home anymore, it felt like a place haunted by broken trust. I started imagining a new place, close to my mom's, where Mona and I could start fresh. Somewhere small and cozy, with a backyard for her to play in and a room she could make her own. Thinking about that gave me hope, a glimpse of something better waiting on the other side of this chaos. Mona's 9th birthday was approaching, and I wanted to make it special for her. She had always dreamed of going to Disneyland, and with everything happening, it felt like the perfect time to give her a magical memory. On the morning of her birthday, I woke her up with pancakes and a small gift wrapped in shiny paper. Inside was a pair of Mickey Mouse ears with her name embroidered on them. Her face lit up as she held them up. "Are we really going to Disneyland?" she asked, her voice full of wonder. When I said yes, she jumped into my arms, laughing in pure joy. That moment reminded me why I was fighting so hard for her. The trip was everything I hoped it would be. Watching Mona's eyes light up at the fireworks and seeing her giggle as she met her favorite characters was a reminder that some things were worth every struggle. On our last night at the park, as the fireworks exploded over the castle, she leaned in and whispered, "You're the best daddy ever." In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened with Zara or how hard things got, Mona was my reason to keep going. Together, we were building something new, and that was all that mattered. The trip to Disneyland was everything I had hoped it would be for Mona, but it also gave me clarity. I wanted more than a fresh start. I wanted a home where she could feel safe and happy, somewhere that was entirely ours. The house I'd shared with Zara wasn't just full of bad memories. It no longer felt like it belonged to me. I needed to move forward, and this was the next step. I started looking seriously for a new house, focusing on places close to my mom's neighborhood. It wasn't easy balancing work, the legal mess with Zara, and house hunting, but each time I found something promising, I'd imagine Mona running through the halls or decorating her own room. It made all the effort feel worthwhile. Eventually, I found it. It wasn't big, but it was perfect. A cozy 2-bedroom house with a small backyard and a tree big enough for Mona to climb when she got older. The neighborhood was quiet, full of families, and just minutes from my mom's place. It felt like the kind of place where we could build something new. When I took Mona to see it for the first time, I didn't tell her it was ours. I wanted it to be a surprise. She ran through the empty rooms, her laughter echoing as she picked out the one she wanted for herself. "This one has the best light for my drawings, Daddy," she said, her excitement spilling over. That afternoon, I told her the truth. It was our new house. Her eyes widened in disbelief before she threw her arms around me. "You mean it's really ours? We're going to live here?" I nodded, and she immediately started planning where she'd put her art supplies and which wall she'd decorate with her favorite pictures. Seeing her so happy made every sacrifice worth it. A few days later, my mom and I helped move in the first round of furniture. It wasn't much at first, a couch, our beds, and some essentials, but it felt like a fresh start. Mona was busy unpacking her books and toys while I worked on assembling her bed. We stopped by my mom's house later that day for Mona's birthday celebration. It was small, just a few family members, but it was filled with warmth. My mom had baked a cake, and Mona insisted on showing everyone the Mickey Mouse ears from our trip. While we ate, Mona brought up one of her favorite parts of Disneyland, the food. "Daddy, tell Grandma about the snacks," she said, grinning with a mouthful of cake. I laughed and told them about the churros she couldn't get enough of and the giant turkey leg she'd insisted on trying. I told her it might be too big, but she said, "No way, Daddy, I can eat it all." I said, winking at Mona. She giggled and added, "But I couldn't. It was as big as my head." The evening ended with Mona curled up on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. As I looked around the room, surrounded by the people who loved us most, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. That night, as we drove back to our new house, Mona was quiet in the back seat, clutching a small plush Minnie Mouse she'd picked out during the trip. When we got home, I tucked her into her bed for the first time and kissed her forehead. "Do you like it here, sweetheart?" I asked. She nodded sleepily. "It's perfect, Daddy." As I closed her door and walked to my own room, I realized she was right. It wasn't just a house. It was home. Life had been a whirlwind lately, and I could feel it taking a toll on both Mona and me. Between the court hearings, the move, and settling into a new routine, we needed a break. Something to remind us that life could still be full of joy. That's when I decided to take her on the ultimate road trip, ending at her favorite place in the world, Disneyland. I told Mona we were going on an adventure, but I didn't tell her where we were headed. She was giddy with excitement, asking 100 questions as we packed the car. She made sure to bring her Minnie Mouse plush, her drawing pad, and a backpack full of snacks she'd picked out herself. We started early, the car humming as the sun peeked over the horizon. Mona was practically bouncing in her seat, guessing wildly about where we might be going. Are we going to Grandma's? The zoo. Oh, I know. A beach. I just smiled and told her to wait and see. Our first stop was at a small diner on the side of the highway. It had a jukebox in the corner, and Mona begged me to let her pick a song. She ended up choosing an old rock and roll tune she didn't know, and we laughed as we tried to dance along in our booth. The staff adored her and even brought out a pancake shaped like Mickey Mouse, which only made her more suspicious about our final destination. After breakfast, we got back on the road, playing games like I Spy and singing along to Mona's playlist, which included every Disney song she could think of. Each time we passed a sign for Disneyland, she pointed it out excitedly, but I kept the surprise going. We stopped for a quick hike at a state park, where Mona was fascinated by the towering trees and the little lizards darting across the trail. She picked up a small rock, declaring it her lucky adventure stone, and tucked it into her backpack. As we got closer to Disneyland, her guesses became more confident. When I finally told her we were going, she gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in disbelief. Are you serious, Daddy? We're really going to Disneyland. Her squeal of delight made my heart soar. The next 2 days were pure magic. We stayed at a hotel near the park, and from the moment we arrived, Mona was in awe. She wore her Minnie Mouse ears proudly as we wandered through the park, her face lighting up at every turn. She met Mickey, hugged Minnie, and insisted on riding every ride she was tall enough for. Her favorite was It's a Small World, which we rode twice just because she loved singing along. She couldn't stop giggling during the spinning teacups, and when the fireworks lit up the night sky over Sleeping Beauty's castle, she grabbed my hand and said, "This is the best day ever, Daddy." I made sure she got all the snacks she'd dreamed of, from churros to a giant turkey leg she could barely hold. She tried a Dole Whip for the first time and declared it her new favorite treat. Every little moment felt special, like we were creating memories she would carry forever. On our last day, Mona picked out a small snow globe with Cinderella's castle inside as her souvenir. She shook it carefully, watching the glitter swirl around, and said it would remind her of her happiest trip. The drive home was quieter. Mona was exhausted from all the excitement and fell asleep clutching her snow globe. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her peaceful face reminding me why this trip had been so important. It wasn't just a road trip or a visit to Disneyland. It was a way to show Mona that no matter what changed in our lives, we could still find magic and happiness together. That no matter how hard things got, we would always have each other. The vacation was exactly what Mona and I needed. Disneyland had been a whirlwind of laughter and magic, and the long drive back gave us time to unwind and savor the memories we'd made. By the time we pulled into the driveway of our new house, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the quiet street. Mona stretched sleepily in the back seat, clutching her snow globe, and smiled when she saw her new home again. "Home sweet home," she said, her voice soft but happy. Walking into the house felt different this time. It wasn't just an empty space anymore. It was ours, filled with the hope of new beginnings. The boxes we hadn't unpacked yet sat waiting in the living room, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt ready to dive in. The next morning, we started turning the house into a home. Mona insisted on unpacking her room first. She carefully arranged her books on the shelves, set up her art supplies on her desk, and placed her Minnie Mouse plush in the middle of her bed. The snow globe found a spot of honor on her nightstand, and she declared her room officially perfect. I focused on the larger tasks, putting together furniture, hanging curtains, and figuring out where everything belonged. Mona was my little helper, handing me tools and offering her opinions on where things should go. "The couch looks better over here, Daddy," she said, dragging a pillow to the corner of the living room. We took breaks to make the process fun. At lunch, we sat on the kitchen floor eating sandwiches and laughing about how the toaster still wasn't plugged in. Later, we danced around the living room to her favorite songs while deciding where to hang a painting my mom had given us. By the end of the week, the house felt alive. Mona's room was bright and colorful, the living room was cozy with throw blankets and family photos, and the kitchen smelled like cookies we'd baked together as a housewarming treat. Even the backyard was starting to take shape, with a small garden bed we planted together one afternoon. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Mona leaned against me and said, "I like it here, Daddy. It feels happy." Her words stayed with me. This house wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of how far we'd come. It was a fresh start for both of us, a chance to build a life that was ours alone. That night, after Mona had gone to bed, I stood in the living room, looking around at the space we'd created. The road to get here had been hard, but as I listened to the quiet hum of the house, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Settling into our new home felt like a fresh start in so many ways, but there was still one big piece missing: my work. I'd left my old job shortly after filing for divorce, unable to balance its relentless demands with everything else going on in my life. For the first time in years, I was jobless, and while it was a relief to have that weight off my shoulders, it also made me nervous. I needed stability for Mona and me, but I didn't want to fall back into the same grind that had taken me away from her in the first place. I started looking for remote jobs, something that would let me work from home and be there for Mona when she needed me. It took a while to find the right fit, but eventually, I landed a role as a consultant for a growing tech company. The work was flexible, the pay decent, and the best part, it allowed me to be present. Working from home was an adjustment, but Mona loved having me around. She'd come into my makeshift office with her latest drawing or just to sit quietly at the edge of the desk while I typed away. On lunch breaks, we'd eat together, and I'd listen to her tell me all about her day at school or the latest book she was reading. At first, I was just grateful to have a steady income and a job that fit our new life. But as I got more comfortable with the work, I started to see opportunities to grow. I proposed a few ideas to my boss, ways to streamline processes and bring in new clients. To my surprise, they took my suggestions seriously, and within months, I was handling bigger projects and earning bonuses. Before I knew it, my efforts were paying off, literally. I started making more money than I ever had at my old job, but this time, it didn't feel like a burden. I was working smarter, not harder, and I didn't have to sacrifice time with Mona to do it. The extra income meant I could finally breathe easier. I set aside money for Mona's college fund, made upgrades to the house, and even started planning a summer vacation for us. It wasn't about the money itself, it was about the freedom it gave us. One afternoon, as I wrapped up a meeting, Mona came into the room with a big smile on her face. She held up a drawing of our house, complete with flowers in the garden and the two of us waving from the front porch. "Look, Daddy. This is us, happy at home," she said proudly. I hung the picture on the wall above my desk, where I could see it every day. It was a reminder of why I was working so hard, not just to make money, but to build a life where Mona could feel secure and loved. Life wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were heading in the right direction. It had been months since Mona last saw Zara. The court-ordered visits had been sporadic, and Zara hadn't pushed as hard as I thought she would to see Mona more often. I didn't know if it was guilt, embarrassment, or just her way of retreating, but for Mona's sake, I kept the door open when Zara reached out for a visit. When I told Mona her mom was coming, she didn't react how I expected. There was no burst of excitement, no immediate questions. Just a quiet nod and a small, "Okay, Daddy." The day of the visit, I watched from the kitchen as Zara arrived. She looked put together, but there was a weariness to her that hadn't been there before. When Mona saw her, she hesitated for a moment before walking over. Zara knelt down and opened her arms, but Mona didn't run into them the way she used to. Instead, she hugged her mom gently, like she was holding something fragile. I stayed out of their way, giving them space but keeping an ear out just in case. They sat on the couch, talking quietly, with Mona doing most of the listening. Zara gave her a small gift, a bracelet with little charms on it. Mona smiled politely and said thank you, but she didn't put it on right away. After Zara left, Mona came to me in the kitchen, her expression thoughtful. "Daddy," she said softly, "I think I understand now. You and Mommy aren't going to be together again, are you?" Her words stopped me in my tracks. I crouched down to her level, meeting her steady gaze. "No, sweetheart, we're not," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean we don't both love you more than anything in the world." She nodded, as if she'd been preparing herself for that answer. "It's okay, Daddy. I just wanted to know for sure." She leaned into me for a hug, and I held her close, marveling at her resilience. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she asked if we could go to the park the next day. "Just you and me," she said, smiling. "Like we always do." I promised we would, and she fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed animal, looking peaceful. In the weeks that followed, I started to notice something shifting within me. I had spent so much time carrying the weight of the past, Zara's betrayal, the divorce, the custody battles. But now, for the first time, it felt like those weights were starting to lift. I found myself smiling more, enjoying the little moments with Mona, and feeling genuinely excited about the future. Our home was filled with laughter and light, and the days didn't feel as heavy anymore. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I realized how far we had come. I wasn't just surviving, I was starting to live again. There was a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years, a feeling that life still had so much to offer. Mona joined me on the porch, her drawing pad in hand. She showed me her latest masterpiece, a picture of us standing in front of our house, surrounded by flowers and sunshine. "Do you like it, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes bright. "I love it, sweetheart," I said, ruffling her hair. "It's perfect, just like you." As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road hadn't been easy, but it had led us here, to a place of hope, happiness, and possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever came next.